Well, I had been mildly conversant in it over the years. In fact, longer ago than I care to remember, like the early 1980s. I actually interviewed Jeffrey Hinton, who got the Nobel Prize and the Turing Award and is sometimes called the godfather of modern AI. But until the large language model revolution, I didn't really appreciate the potential power of the technology. Even though, I had asked him in the 80s, like, what's your approach and everything? And his approach is the one that prevailed. These large language models are built on neural networks with so called massive parallelism. That's what he was advocating at the time. But I really didn't get the picture back then about how potentially powerful this could be. And now I'm convinced that this is going to be a complete earthquake in terms of overall social impact, and that we're not thinking nearly as carefully about it as we need to be thinking.
And when you say overall social impact, do you mean sort of jobs or something else?
Yeah, I mean, I don't rule out the hardcore doomer scenarios. Like, it, I, I'm agnostic on the idea that AI could actually take over. But the more I've looked into it, the harder I find it to completely eliminate that possibility. But even leaving that aside, when you look at the impact on things like jobs, on just our way of life, people using AIs as companions, the capacity of AI to persuade people of things, and therefore the ability of so-called bad actors to use it to to get bad effects, you know using it to make bioweapons and so on. I think if you look at the overall impact and how fast this is going to happen, um, you may come to agree with me that we're looking at it exactly the wrong way. And the way we're looking at it is as this big race there where we have to beat China. And I think full speed ahead is like a really bad motto for this technology.
Yeah, well, I want to get onto P Doom and the race. I've got some clips of Dario Amodei, Sam Altman. I know people you speak a lot about on your brilliant podcast. A question I wanted to ask you, though, as someone who, I discovered via your writing about evolution, is do you think that AI is evolving? And I suppose what I mean by this, and this seems sort of significant to me when it comes to the control question. So most technologies are designed, right? So someone's written the algorithm and you know exactly how they work. To me, it seems like a lot of these AI programs are more analogous to evolution because, especially when it comes to reinforcement learning, you're not telling it how to solve a maths problem. You're not telling it how to do coding. You're saying, if you get the maths problem right, that's a reward. If you get the coding problem right, that's a reward. If you get it wrong, you get a punishment. And that to me seems like a recipe for I suppose the development of emergent properties we might not understand. You obviously have studied evolution a lot more than I have. You're writing a book about AI. I'm not. What can you tell me about whether or not you think AI is analogous to evolution?
Yeah, my book does emphasize evolution a lot as a way to look at the way technologies develop generally, but certainly including AI. And among the implications of that is, we're not going to really be in control of this process. I mean, we never are with technologies, right? But as you suggested, this technology is kind of particularly opaque. It is by a kind of a process of evolution that these large language models take shape. We don't reach in and connect the neurons up, and we don't understand exactly how they're hooked up. We just know that these things behave increasingly as if they were at least as smart as us. Um, and so, yeah, I think technology can be viewed as a kind of a straightforward continuation of biological evolution because the way it takes shape has so much in common with the way biological organisms take shape. But in any event, I absolutely agree that there are emergent properties. There have been emergent properties. We've seen things that weren't really intentionally designed in, but turn out to be properties of these machines. And some of them aren't great properties, like, deception, for example. So I just think there's plenty of reason to be careful about this. And I think ultimately, all the nations of the world are going to have to address this problem together. And right now, we're looking at this in the opposite way, right? It's like it's nation versus nation. If we win, everything will be great. I don't think so.
Do you think AI could be conscious? I mean, this is, in a way, this is a question of definitions, but it's a big argument with, I suppose, political and obviously moral implications. If AI programs are developing emergent properties in the same way that biological evolution created this emergent property of consciousness, could the evolution of AI agents create a property of conscious, I suppose, silicon agents?
I mean, they could be conscious now, strictly speaking, because the distinctive characteristic of consciousness, or one of them, is that you can never be sure whether anything other than you has it, right? I mean, I've always assumed that, like, my dogs have some sentience. It's like something to be them, but I never know for sure. And strictly speaking, I don't even know that it's like something to be my wife, although I'm willing to take her word for it. And I'm willing to assume that, all other humans are conscious. But you there's there's never any way of really verifying that for sure. And that's why consciousness as a subject matter is just different from everything else that science tries to study. It's just not publicly observable. So I don't rule out the possibility that AI is conscious or could become conscious. The question is consciousness, what they call a substrate independent property. In other words, do certain kinds of information processing give rise to it, regardless of whether the substrate is, the organic chemistry that constitutes us or silicon? And it seems to me plausible that, the metaphysics of consciousness could be such that it's just a property of certain kinds of information processing, and it doesn't matter what the material is. In which case, you would imagine that AI, if it's not conscious now, will eventually become that.
Let's talk about PDOOM. That's the word that people in Silicon Valley, I suppose, use. It means probability of doom, so probability of extinction from AI. I want to sort of get into this by showing clips of Jeff Hinton, who you mentioned before. He developed the technology. You interviewed him, you said a few decades ago, I think. Sam Altman, everyone knows who Sam Altman is. And then Ben Mann, who is co-founder of Anthropic.
There's still a chance that we can figure out how to develop AI that won't want to take over from us. And because there's a chance, we should put enormous resources into trying to figure that out. Because if we don't, it's going to take over.
I think AI will probably, most likely, sort of lead to the end of the world. But in the meantime, there will be great companies created with serious machine learning.
How much time do we have, Ben?
So I think 50th percentile chance of hitting some kind of superintelligence in just a small handful of years is probably reasonable. My best granularity of forecast for could we have an X risk or extremely bad outcome from AI is somewhere between 0 and 10%.
So somewhere between 0 and 10%. Well, you're giggling, as the technology that your company is developing, you're suggesting could kill all of us. The statement from Sam Altman there, it might kill us all, but it will create some good companies in the meantime and some profit for me. Bob, I suppose there's two ways of interpreting. Let's put Jeff Hinton to one side, I suppose, for a moment, but Sam Altman and the Anthropic co-founder. Are they being incredibly irresponsible because they think that the technology they're developing could end the world and they're doing it anyway? Or are they bullshitting us? So lots of people suggest that sort of by, in their words, exaggerating the existential threat, they are distracting from the current harms the technology is doing, and also potentially overemphasizing the potential and capacity and the power of the technologies they control. Because obviously, if you say this could end the world, then if you're an investor, you think, well, this is presumably pretty powerful. Maybe I should put some money into that. What's your take on that whole debate?
Well, I certainly think Jeff Hinton is being sincere. As for Altman, most of his more extreme pronouncements about doom were some time ago. He's gotten increasingly upbeat as he's come to realize that it looks kind of ridiculous if he's racing to accelerate our demise. It's hard to say how sincere he was in the first place, because remember, when he first started talking about this, that was about the time he was trying to get Elon Musk involved in investing in or contributing to OpenAI, and Elon was something of a doomer. So it's what you would say if you wanted to get Elon Musk involved in the collaboration you got him involved in. That said, I what he's saying about doom being one, certainly one possible outcome. A lot of people in his milieu believe that. He, I think, read the book Superintelligence by Nick Bostrom, which a lot of them read and which got a lot of them worried. So, Altman, I tend to be agnostic on his degree of sincerity at any given moment. But there are a lot of smart and serious people who know the technology better than I do, who are very worried about actual extinction.
I should say the Sam Altman clip actually there was from 2015. I hadn't seen it before. I only discovered it today. You've had Max Tegmark on your podcast, someone who I think is very impressive, who's very worried about extinction, whose argument I found very persuasive. I think he was suggesting, because he had a very sort of hard-headed approach, I think, which was to say the only thing that's going to save us from AI taking over is the American or Chinese security establishments saying we don't want anything to have control that isn't us, and so them clamping down on it. I suppose, is that, I don't know what your position was on that, but when you sort of look at future scenarios, how do you see us preventing doom if we can?
Look, I think if AI really does have this potential and even tendency, once it gets out of control, to take over and either kill us or stuff us into gooey pods like in the Matrix, which, by the way, doesn't sound like, I assume the hallucinations they were piping into their brains were pleasant, so I guess there's worse things to happen. But if it has that tendency, it's not going to be that easy to stifle it, because it's a technology that's not amenable to centralized control, even the way nuclear technology is, right? Even nuclear weapons are an easier technology to kind of identify and reach international agreements about and truly control than AI is. But we don't know if it really does have this tendency. And in any event, I think if we're going to pay enough attention to that possibility and address the many other issues, there are two principles here. Slower is better, whereas almost everyone is now saying faster is better. I mean, everyone, who gets airtime. And international collaboration is going to be essential. If we go through this revolution locked in a bitter Cold War with China, that increases the chances of bad things happening, up to and including extinction, even though that's not really the thing I mainly think about. I think about other, forms of dislocation and destabilization that would be horrible in their own right. But I think the chances of true doom are significant enough that we should be taking them seriously, and almost no one in power is acting as if we should be.
Okay, your discussion of Cold War competition and races gives me a great segue into a clip of our next AI CEO. And this is Dario Amodei explaining earlier this year why he thinks it's imperative that the United States stays ahead of China in any AI race.
If the U.S. is a couple years ahead of China, we can use that couple years to make things safe. If we're even with China, there's no promoting an arms race. That's what's going to happen. The technology has immense military value. Whatever people say now, whatever nice words they say about cooperation, I just don't see how, once people fully understand the economic and military value of the technology, which I think they mostly already do, I don't see any way that it turns into anything other than the most intense race. And so what I can think of to try and give us more time is if we can slow down the authoritarians, that it almost obviates the trade-off. It gives us more time to work out among us, among OpenAI, among Google, among X.AI, how to make these models safe.
So, I think you're going to agree with me here, Bob, but the thing I find least persuasive about what Dario Amodei said there is that the people who are going to keep us safe, he thinks, are the leaders of OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, and X. Like the idea that so long as we can keep the Chinese down, we can have some kind of responsible approach to AI, when it seems to me that the real race is not so much between the US and China. Well, I mean, that clearly is happening, but the race seems to be more between OpenAI, DeepMind, Anthropic, X, than it is on an international level. But I suppose, how are you interpreting what someone like Dario Amodei says? Do you think he believes what he says, or is this just him cynically trying to shape government policy to his advantage?
Yeah, well, before elaborating on why I agree with the first point you made, I give him credit for being sincere. Not everyone agrees. I think if you look closely at what he said over the years, he's always been kind of ideologically deeply concerned about the authoritarian potential of AI, which, first of all, is definitely something to worry about, but also convinced that China, if allowed to, will use the AI to subvert our own form of government and turn us into an authoritarian nation. And I personally haven't seen any evidence for that. I think that's where he's wrong. And when I say I give him credit for being sincere, the reason I say that is because so many people in this business are saying roughly the same thing and aren't sincere. Saying that we have to worry about China is, the optimal thing for an AI lobbyist to say, because it means you can't regulate us, you can't hobble us in this existential race against China. And in fact, you should subsidize our massive consumption of energy and help us build these power plants, even though it seems like only yesterday people were concerned about climate change. So I do think Dario is sincere, but I agree with you that, the idea that if we're a year or two ahead of China, then Sam Altman will go on a 3-month vacation or something is crazy. Capitalism doesn't need a foreign country to move full speed ahead. This is just what it does. And in fact, Dario kind of made the point last week, unintentionally, because I think most people say we are at least somewhat ahead of China now, but only last week, Dario said, I'm going to have to change my strategy a little. I had said that because of there's this authoritarian threat, Anthropic will not take money from these like autocratic, authoritarian nations like the Persian Gulf states. Well, only last week he said, look, competitive reality is forcing me to do this. I have to do it. And he wasn't even talking about China. He was explicitly talking about OpenAI as the competitive driving force. So I completely agree with you. The other thing I'd say is that if you look at the scenario he has sketched out for what we do with this dominance over China that he wants us to establish, by, among other things, of course, restricting tech exports to China and doing all these things he wants to do, I don't think it makes sense. I mean, his plan seems to be he wants a coalition of democracies. I mean, this is before last week when he decided that the coalition could include, a few authoritarian autocratic nations, but he basically wants a coalition of democracies to establish such a lead over AI that, once you get to superintelligence, you're just totally in charge, and then China will submit to our will. There's so many problems with this scenario. I mean, first of all, he's a little vague on what we do once they submit to our will. I think he seems to be demanding that they acknowledge that their form of government is wrong or something and ours is right. Well, you may have to wait a long time for that. But the other thing, of course, is that if they agree with him that this race to superintelligence is of existential importance and whoever wins rules the world, well, as some people pointed out, wouldn't shock me if they start resorting to extreme measures, if they sense that we're getting close to superintelligence, right? Like for starters, bombing the factory that's not very far from them in Taiwan, the factories that produce the state-of-the-art chips. And by the way, by denying them of those chips, we've only strengthened the logic, actually, behind them attacking, because they're not really getting much out of those factories now, not as much as they were. So I don't know. I mean, Dario's logic at so many levels makes no sense to me. And I think it's kind of a shame that the debate is so dominated by people who are clearly brilliant in one realm, like making technology, but aren't necessarily, masters of geopolitical theory.
And you talk a lot about geopolitics on your Non-Zero podcast. Lots of guests along those lines. I know you have mentioned a few times on the podcast, I've heard you explain sort of your argument, which I think is persuasive, that forget about Trump, even Biden's export controls for advanced chips, 90% of which are made in Taiwan, and now the Chinese can't have them. That would give the Chinese a massive incentive to say, well, if you're denying us the most important technology in the world, which is produced on an island very close to us that we think is part of our country, then that is enough provocation for us to say, okay, we're going to reunite China and Taiwan, which we've always thought is our right anyway. But my question to you: Are you surprised that hasn't happened yet? Because obviously China can construct an argument as to why that was a casus bellus to invade Taiwan. Yeah, it doesn't seem closer. Maybe I'm being naive.
There are a lot of reasons for China not to attack Taiwan, especially now, because they're in the process of a military buildup, and the chances of a successful invasion may well grow because of that. I also think they'd rather resolve the whole thing peacefully. In other words, Taiwan to become kind of a de facto part of China or whatever. Taiwan's it's a hard island to invade if you look at the geography of it and how few kind of beaches there are and how many cliffs there are and so on. But my main point is that the way I tend to put it is that the disincentive for them to invade has definitely been reduced by our policy of denying them the most advanced chips coming out of those factories. And as you said, remember, they think of Taiwan as part of China. So they're thinking like, wait a second, these factories, they were created by people who actually are Chinese. And I should add, by the way, the U.S. even does not recognize Taiwan as a sovereign nation. We have a so-called one China policy. Our only insistence has been, resolve this thing peacefully. It just seems that even if they don't set out to disable the factory, they know that a war is likely to leave it disabled. We have a lot of ways to disable those factories, not just with bombs, actually. And so, there used to be this, those factories used to be this kind of form of reassurance that it wasn't in China's interest to invade Taiwan because they were getting the same kind of chips out of the factories that we were. But now that we've changed that, the way I would put it is it reduces their disincentive to invade, but the disincentive is for now pretty strong. I wouldn't expect it to happen overnight. Now, that said, if it does seem that we're ahead of them in this race, as Dario wants, and we seem to be getting close to this superintelligence thing, assuming you buy the idea that it's this distinct threshold such that whoever gets there first is suddenly miles ahead, then, the disincentive to do something violent with Taiwan will recede further.
I want to talk about the ideologies that dominate in Silicon Valley. So there's transhumanism, rationalism, effective altruism. But I want to lead into this conversation with a clip of Peter Thiel.
You would prefer the human race to endure, right? You're hesitating.
Yeah, well,
yes?
I don't know. I would.
This is a long hesitation. There's so many
questions implicit
Should
in this.
the human race survive? Yes.
That's one of the most respected people in Silicon Valley, Trump backer, earliest investor in Facebook, obviously the chair of Palantir. Bob, I mean, how worried are you about the kind of people who are in control of this technology? Because, I mean, you said at the start of this interview, the start of this conversation, that you think AI is a really big deal, that it's going to radically transform the world. And the ideas of some of the people running this are concerning, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, Thiel gives me several grounds for concern, I would say. I mean, he's just kind of a militaristic hawk. I'm not sure what he was thinking, because I do think he would like the human species to survive. I don't know. I wasn't aware that he was a so-called successionist. In other words, just thinks that it's a natural order of things for AI to take our place. There are people who believe that. And they would say, look, if the AI is conscious, it's capable of, enjoyment and everything, then maybe that's not that bad. So there's that whole argument. I wasn't aware that he was a successionist. He does, have a number of views that alarm me. He's very anti-international governance. In fact, he's compared world government to the Antichrist. And I agree, by the way, that you have to be careful with international governance. You want the power as decentralized as possible. That said, I don't think we can get through this thing without having more in the way of international agreements than we're accustomed to having. And so that view of his concerns me. He was, I guess, a co-founder of Palantir, which, by the way, this shows you, what kind of effect all the money and technology can have. Palantir, which is it's like an AI / military and immigration control and all kinds of things company, announced, I think last week, that they're going to start putting money into movies and other entertainment products that emphasize how evil China is and how evil Iran is, and so on. Which makes sense. I mean, Palantir gets a ton of money from the Pentagon, so the more terrified Americans are of foreign countries, the better. But these guys have a lot of money, and so I guess I've strayed from your original question. There are successionists in Silicon Valley. I'm not sure if Thiel is one of them, but I do find him, creepy.
What do you think about the successionists? And I suppose, because the argument is that there's no reason why, what do they call us, meaty? There's no reason why people should have moral or extra moral standing because they're biological. And if you made a conscious AI, it should have just as much moral standing as the meaty version. I think this ideology would take us to very dangerous places, which is why I'm not into it. But I suppose as someone who has spent a lot of time looking at ethics, religion, Buddhism, so how would you either approach that argument or counter that argument? What's your sort of take on it?
I personally want to hang around, and I want my kids to hang around. And if they have kids, I want them to hang around. It just seems like, why would you want to throw away, even if AI is conscious, and even if you believe that grants it moral status on par with us, why would you want to throw away, a distinctive form of consciousness? AI will never be us. And, in a way, I kind of, same way I wouldn't want to wipe out a whole benign conscious species. I mean, I assume they're sentient, like dogs. And now I do take seriously enough the possibility, I don't know what probability I assign it, but the possibility that AI will ultimately be a true force to be reckoned with, and in some sense will be autonomous and even unified, maybe. I don't know, all the AIs getting together and, saying, they want to be treated well. I, I, that is possible enough for me to think that best case may be for us to negotiate. I'm talking distant future, I hope, but for us to negotiate a kind of non-zero sum relationship with them, like a win-win relationship. It's like, hey, we stick around, you stick around. It's not like we would be some huge threat to them. I mean, if they're as smart as everybody says they're going to be, surely they can figure out a way to let us hang around and for them to still, thrive. So I think there's a non-trivial chance it'll ultimately come to trying to do something like that. But again, if that's what we want, full speed ahead is a super bad motto, because that's the way things get out of control. If controlling the AI is going to be a challenge, and look, controlling it in some sense is definitely going to be a challenge. There will be rogue AIs with huge destructive potential. But even if it's a challenge in this larger, more sci-fi sense of it being this potentially dominant species, then, it may come down to trying to work out an arrangement, and you do not want to be moving ahead recklessly and risking that things will get out of control.
If anyone's watching this thinking, what the hell are you talking about? Who are these people who are happy for artificial intelligence to replace humans? You could look up someone called Richard Sutton, who's very distinguished. I think the godfather of machine learning or something they call him. He won the Turing Award this year, which is kind of the Nobel Prize for computing. Sort of suggested, who are we to think that we should be around forever? If we make a more intelligent machine than ourselves, then we should pass on the universe to them. There's also a podcast called The Trajectory that I fell down a bit of a rabbit hole in, where he interviews so many of the top people in this industry. I think he describes himself as a post-humanist.
Successionist, I get a little confused, but he talks the talk a lot.
There's been lots of doom. Let's end on a positive note. In your studies of AI, what's the upside? Is there a possible world where AI leads to radical abundance, world peace, some kind of luxury communism?
I think it has the potential to lead to radical abundance and all kinds of great things. It does. I mean, medical breakthroughs, scientific breakthroughs, all of that. And as for world peace, it could even play a constructive role in helping humans overcome certain kinds of cognitive biases that give rise to conflict between groups. I'm thinking about that kind of stuff and hoping that it will happen. It will. I do think it will radically increase human productivity, and unfortunately, that's another term for people losing their jobs in many contexts, at least. And even if it works out well, so that the people lose their jobs, but they wind up happy, or maybe they find new jobs for a while that are enriching. Still, just the transition effect, can be very destabilizing. And to go back to the beginning of the conversation, I would say there are just lots of areas where there are going to be these destabilizing effects. So leave the doom scenarios aside. I think slower is better. And look, it's not like there's a speed control knob, but right now, the prevailing vibe in America is, no, regulation is bad. It's not like it might be bad in and of itself, but we just can't afford to slow this technology down. No, I would emphasize that this is a case where stifling innovation is a feature, not a bug. This thing is going to move along plenty fast, even if we don't give it the assistance of the government via subsidies. And even if we do subject it to some regulation. Now, I do think that, if you're going to regulate it in a significant way, you need to be on the same page as other countries. But I just can't overemphasize the importance of taking care and trying to do this in a deliberate way. And if we do, it could be a wonderful world. It really could. This I do think the technology is going to be powerful in ways that we can direct in a positive direction in principle.
Robert Wright, thank you so much for your time. Can't wait for the book. I recommend our viewers go and listen to your Non-Zero podcast. Always very interesting. Thank you for joining me on Novara.
Thank you.